My name is Karen Cummins. I am the Partnerships Chair at AMA New York, where we work every day to inspire, support, and celebrate brilliance in marketing. And of course, we thrive in the center of the world's most influential business city. And as an AMA New York member, you have access to the most relevant and compelling data, tools, insights, and people available in New York. So I invite you to join our organization, where you can access essential resources in our library. You can expand your network and knowledge through a full schedule of events, network amongst your peers, and elevate your leadership, which can include volunteering, providing expertise, and mentoring in our mentoring program. Our events calendar includes a wide variety of career development and networking programs. Here's a few that are coming up. On January 21st, we begin another round of our popular Women in Marketing series. This one is Take Your Seat at the Table, Leadership Strategies for the New Decade, and a virtual conversation with Margaret Malloy, who's the Global CMO of Siegel and Gale. On January 27th, we're having a media and entertainment panel on how COVID changed the need for digital engagement with top marketers in this sector. And on February 10th and February 17th, we have a two-part marketers boot camp on how to create an ATS-friendly resume. That's automated tracking system, for those of you who don't know, and how to get a job anywhere with no connections. So sign me up for that. I'm all in. Be sure to connect with us on social media to stay tuned with what's happening at AMA New York. If you are interested in joining AMA New York, we're happy to answer any questions about our member benefits and how you can maximize your membership. Before we begin, I want to thank today's sponsor, Women in Cable Telecommunications, for partnering with AMA New York on this event. And I'd like to introduce Brook Smith, who is the Vice President of Women in Cable Television New York, and also a member of the partner strategy team at NBC Universal, to say a few words. So Brook.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. And, happy Thursday. Wanted to just say thank you so much to AMA and to Karen for having us attend this event and be a sponsor. We are so excited to be partnering with you today. WICT is an organization that prides ourselves on uplifting and empowering women. We also have men, so if you're a man that's joining today, don't be afraid by the title of our organization. We welcome anyone and everyone who is willing to uplift and empower those who need it most. Our organization is comprised upon several touchstones, and we also have opportunities for mentorship, and for our programming and events is incredible. We don't have a calendar here, but if anyone is interested, I'll share my information in the chat, and please reach out to me if you want to know any more about WICT New York and what we can offer you as far as membership goes. Thank you again, Karen, for having us, and Jacqueline, I'm thrilled and so excited to hear what you have to say today. Karen, I have to say that plug for the last event that you mentioned, getting a job with no connections, and I'm sign me up. I'm there.
Right?
That happened. So you guys have AMA has an incredible just calendar coming up for events, and I'm really looking forward to attending some of those as well. So thank you all for WICT New York, and I guess I'll throw it back to you, Karen, for the event.
Thank you so much, Brooke. So before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to mention there will be a brief Q&A at the end. So feel free to put questions in the chat room, and we'll go through the questions at the end of the presentation. So our guest speaker today, as I mentioned, is Jacqueline Strayer. She's a communication and marketing thought leader, consultant, cultural enthusiast, and human rights advocate. She served as an elected officer of 3 global publicly traded Fortune 500 companies overseeing marketing and communications. She's also a faculty member in graduate and executive programs at NYU and Columbia University. She's spent her life advancing the arts, serving on boards of public television and radio stations, performing arts centers, independent theaters and film festivals, and she writes about contemporary issues and their relationship to leadership, marketing, and the public relations space. She believes everyone has a great story to tell. So that said, Jacqueline, take it away.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor for me to be with such an incredible group of people today and to talk about this topic. And, we have a very, very robust agenda and schedule. So I want to take you through what we're going to actually go through today. So as we look at it, what are we going to cover? We're going to talk about what conflict is, the stages of conflict, and how that occurs. We'll talk about how you enter a stressful conversation and the tactics you would consider. We'll talk about toxic leaders, toxic employees, and toxic cultures, and the types that you might encounter and their implications, some of which you can do something about, and some of which are so beyond our capabilities that we just have to recognize them. I'll also discuss the pandemic and the post-pandemic organizational behavioral consequences. One of the things I should mention to you is I teach a class at Columbia in graduate school called Human Behavior in the Organization. And so part of this content is actually structured around what I talk about in the classroom. And what's really important is we talk about this topic in this moment, because we can talk about human behavior, but there are very, very important implications in terms of what we're experiencing now and what we look to the future in terms of the post-pandemic and how we think about this topic. So what intentionally we hope you're going to learn today are some tactics to navigate and address different types of stressful and contentious conversations, some of the emotional issues and behaviors the pandemic has created, what behaviors you can expect post-pandemic, and the value of your EQ versus your IQ, and how to show up emotionally in control. So, what was our world before, right? This is Times Square, lots of people milling about, packed places, people going to Broadway shows and restaurants. And this is it now. Same lights on, but nobody there, right? And if you're a New Yorker, you know this scene extremely well. How we worked before with each other. Obviously we were free flowing, we were in person, we had no masks on, we were close. How we're working now, with masks on, remotely, not with each other for the most part, very different scenario. We all know this well. If we look at some of the data, it's very interesting in terms of where things stand. So in 2019, an average of about 175,000 people left their jobs each day. And of those people, 55,000 of them were laid off or fired. But on average, net, we actually gained more people than we lost than the prior year, which is an important thing to keep in front of us in terms of where we are. So in this year, basically, we're suffering from what we call the Groundhog Syndrome. And we'll talk about that a little bit. This past year, in the United States alone, we lost 22 million jobs. That's the latest data that I have. And it's expected that it's going to take 4 years to recover. Globally, just from April to June, 305 million jobs were lost. So those of us who have worked in global companies, the consequences are quite dramatic. And what are we feeling? The loss of real-time interactivity. We don't relate to each other in person. There's a lot of emotional reactivity in the moment. There's performance problems. There's uncertainty, chaos, what's called VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. And there's Groundhog Day syndrome, which many of you have probably seen that movie, where basically the main character is living his life over and over again the same day. That's how we're living our lives. People have become more resistant to change. The routines that we had have evaporated. That coffee that you had with your friend before work every day in person at the coffee shop no longer happens, right? And the social and economic inequities have really become much more pronounced and basically real to us all and visible. And so what has happened is organizations are taking a much more dramatic and drastic step to address them and talking out about them. And we've also seen the issues around balance and imbalance of work-life issues, right? Those of us who are moms, who have young children, those of us who have elderly parents, these all becomes part of our work life because we are working remotely, and that has become much more visible. But post-pandemic, how do we look at some of this? So people are going to have this heightened sense of space, like where you physically are, and the surfaces, what we touch, and each other, right? Right now, sometimes we see somebody coming down the street, we look upon another person as a potential weapon, a lethal opportunity waiting to happen. So I think that's one of the things that we see in terms of other people that are strangers. Personal safety will become more present, conscious, and a constant concern. There'll be a lot more needs around mental, emotional, and physical health and well-being. Social distance will make basically our needs for community that much more important. And people will no longer view like remote working as basically an amenity. It's something that's a must-have. So it's something that's become a standard practice of how we work. And many workers expect to maintain the privacy that they've had working remotely, and keeping that even when they go back to work. And then there's a lot that's been written about the lack of privacy that companies have already implemented certain ways in which they can watch what you're doing on your computer during the workday. So this becomes all part of the discussion as we think about the post-pandemic world. And of course, people expect that health and wellness to be built into everything. So let me ask you a question and just think about this. Did you ever feel like your boss played favorites? Had to work with an emotional train wreck? Blurted out something when angry that created damage that was hard for you to recover from? Felt like the workplace was out of control? Well, you're not alone. And if you answered yes, and maybe you answered yes to every one of those questions, 80% of Americans are stressed out at work. And for 7 out of 10 say the pandemic has become the most stressful part of their career. And how is stress created? It's often created by conflict. So what is conflict, right? It's a difference of opinion between people, right? It's caused by the actual or perceived opposition of the needs, the values, and the interests among people in the workplace. And it could be over something that you have to do, a task. It could be over a relationship, or it could be over values, right? And we're seeing that values one play out a lot about. I do a lot of work in values. It's very interesting because the majority of people do not actually adhere to or agree with their organizational values, which is very interesting. But that's another discussion, but to keep in mind. So how do we look at the stages of conflict? Well, much like we look at the stages of grief and all of that, there are stages of conflict. So at the beginning, you've got, basically differing goals, whatever you're trying to achieve, and you go through this arc, right? You go through this path of basically competing demands, issue expansion over the conflict, there's hostility, and then basically you come to a place where you're, on the descending. This is the ascending part of the conflict, and the descending, you go through negotiation, settlement, and hopefully there's peace building as a result of this work. But also, if you avoid conflict, which it can create a whole host of other problems. You can actually see an increase in terms of bullying, detachment, resentment, end of communication and productivity, absenteeism, engagement. And of course, engagement we talk about a lot in organizations. And of course, people start leaving. But disagreements are inevitable, right? You always wonder about the couple that never fight. Like, do they actually really talk to each other? Because how could you have a relationship where everyone is in agreement? Disagreements are inevitable, and they are a normal and healthy part of relating to people. In fact, I like to look at terms of creative collaborations. A lot of the best creative collaborations happened with people that didn't necessarily agree. Jerry Goffin and Carole King were great songwriting partners, but they didn't necessarily agree, yet they had over 24 chart-topping hit songs. And they're a normal, healthy part of how we relate to people. There's no such thing as a conflict-free environment, and you should be careful if you're in one where people don't have conflict. And basically, disagreements can lead to better work products, opportunities to grow, better relationships, and a more inclusive work environment, right? But unhealthy conflict can become toxic and create a lack of trust, lower productivity, an increase in motivation, decrease in motivation, a lack of interest, and an increase of stress, and change in how an employee feels about their job, their boss, or their coworkers. Also, it can basically cultivate destructive gossip that becomes part of your culture. People start getting sick more often, more turnover, and of course, there's a formation of those dangerous cliques that leave people out. Remember those from high school where you were either in one or out of one? Well, they're very dangerous, and they can become very, very, very toxic in an environment. So what do you do about conflict? You embrace it. Don't avoid it, right? So this is a really important thing. You want to view conflict as an opportunity rather than a threat. And you want to ensure that you're talking together, you're listening carefully, you're finding agreement, choosing your battles. We all know this is something probably your mother told you growing up. Choosing your battles are really important. And keep the communication open, but also be quick to forgive. That's really important. And very, very important, Be open to the possibility that you're wrong. At the beginning of every one of my classes that I teach, and I teach 9 different classes between NYU and Columbia, one of the things that's really interesting is I start every class with a piece from Daniel Levitin, the neuroscientist, musician, and faculty member at many, many distinguished universities across the country. And he basically tells people that if you think you know everything, you can't learn anything. And so you need to understand that you're wrong. And you need to be open to be able to say that. So it's a really, really important aspect. But what is the consequence of what we call incivility, which is on the rise? In other words, just being rude. Let's look at that. The data shows that there are big consequences for rude people, right? They have decreased work ethic. Basically, they spend less time at work. The quality of their work is not as good. They worry about the incivility and the rudeness afterwards. They lose time avoiding the person who is rude to them, right? Their performance declines. Their commitment to the organization goes down. They leave their job or they take their frustration out on others. So it has enormous consequences. So as we look at that, how is it playing out? We are finding now in this moment new ways to be rude, right? What we have is an increase in email rudeness. So people can't be rude to you in person, so they're finding other ways to be rude to you. So they're sending notes to your inbox, which can be really damaging. And we all know that emails in general can be kind of misconstrued anyway. Well, rudeness is one of those things that's really happening. And there's a lot of data that shows what's happened over the course of the last year. And of course, this leads to stressful conversations. So we think about all this incivility and the stress that we're under. So what's the first stressful conversation you might have? You know, it is stressful when you tell your boss that you're quitting, right? You're leaving your job. Delivering bad news is difficult. You're tense, the person you're telling is tense, and the main challenge for you is to get it off right from the start. So that's really important. So how do you think about approaching the conversation about, you know, I'm quitting? Basically, the key to resigning gracefully, and that's the operative word here, gracefully, is to keep it short and direct. You know, you're not apologizing. You're basically saying, I've really appreciated my time here. I've made this difficult decision and I'm moving on. If you can say where you're going, you say where you're going. And then my last day will be thus and so. It's normal to feel some regret because you're closing a chapter of your life and moving on to the next. But it's really important to keep this really, really simple. Really, that's the operative way. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have to fire someone. No one likes to do this. And we're not talking firing somebody because they stole for the company or had an ethical breach. We're talking about generally a performance, issue here. This is not like a mass scale workforce reduction thing. This is something around performance. So it's really important that you don't shirk responsibility. Some people don't like to it to the extent that they, in order to avoid it, they'll promote the person out of the job so it's just so they don't have to deal with that. And I've seen this happen. This responsibility should not be shirked, and it's one of the hardest things that you have to do. And it's natural to feel bad about it. But what this should be is basically the culmination of a series of conversations that you've had up to this point. So how do you approach it? Basically, it's the final installment of an ongoing conversation. It shouldn't be that something all of a sudden somebody's finding out that they're not doing their job. And so the person should not be blindsided. You basically want to make sure that you've warned this person over time that their progress is not what it needs to be and that their job will be in jeopardy. So that when you finally have the ultimate conversation that you have to let the person go, it's not an unexpected thing if this person hasn't improved. So that's a really important way of looking at it. Now, on the other hand, this is a really hard one. Stop harassing me. Whether it's sexual harassment, where I've done a tremendous amount of work, racist comments, ageism, or other issues. We know that even though in the United States and other places where there are laws against that, people still do it. Now, it's kind of interesting how it's played out in this environment, in the remote environment. There's a lot of work that's been done about that in particular. But as we look at stop harassing you, how do you get at that? First of all, if you're not comfortable saying anything about it, you can go to the company's human resources department, who has an obligation to do something about it. So if you don't feel comfortable, and sometimes people don't feel comfortable going to their human resources department, you can either go to your boss if they're not the person that's harassing you, or you can actually go to somebody else who's in a para position, who's an aligned professional who can help you. And basically the other way is if you are willing to say something to the offender on your own, then you can basically have that conversation with this person and let them know that their behavior is unwelcome and that you want it to stop. These are not easy conversations, and we know that a lot of harassers, a lot of people who have been harassed, harassees, end up leaving their jobs over it. It's because it's so hard to be able to navigate in the workplace. You made a big mistake, okay? Everybody makes big mistakes at work. So the important thing is when you make a big mistake that you own up to it. Why? Because if you don't own up to your mistake, it's going to be found out anyway. And you're better off basically telling people about it rather than waiting for someone to basically tell others that you made this mistake. So what do? You be as straightforward as possible. You make it clear that you understand the seriousness of your mistake. Generally, your boss will basically have a higher opinion of you for having the integrity to come forward, but you do have to, basically acknowledge that there could be fallout from the fact that you made this mistake anyway. So we all know that ground and what that means. So how do you prepare for a stressful conversation? Basically, conversation management. You want to be incredibly clear. You want the words to do the work. Words matter. And you want to make sure this because people are listening to your words, but they may not always hear the words correctly. So it's really important that you know what you're saying, and tell people clearly what you mean. Direct does not have to be harsh. And that's the other thing that's really important in terms of how we think about tone. So the intonation of how you say the words, the facial expressions of how you use those, how you say those words, and your body language, that all becomes part of actually the experience of whatever the stressful conversation is. And so, you look at the conflict between debate and dialogue. You don't want it to become a debate. You want it to become a dialogue. In a debate, you're assuming that there is a right answer. In a dialogue, you assume that people have the pieces to the answer, and together you can work out a solution. In a debate, it's combative, trying to prove the other person wrong. In this case, on the dialogue side, you want to be collaborative. In a debate, it's about winning. In a dialogue, it's about exploring common ground. In a debate, it's about listening to find flaws. And then in a dialogue, it's listening to understand. In a debate, it's about defending what you believe. In a dialogue, it's revealing assumptions for evaluation. And then finally, in a dialogue, you're seeking a conclusion or a vote that ratifies your position and affirms your right. In a dialogue, you're discovering new options, not necessarily seeking closure. So if we go back, let's see, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Sorry. Okay, so how do we look at, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem here. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem with my presentation here. Just go back. I have a new computer, so this is my stressful moment here. Let me just, okay. Here we go. All right.
And just reshare.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I had a little bit of technical problem here. So then we look at basically the bad apple. We look at toxic behavior. So what is toxic workplace behavior? That refers to when, can everyone see this okay?
Jacqueline, you have to share your screen again.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. So how do we look at the bad apple, right? So as we think about toxic behavior, toxic workplace behavior refers to when a person with power uses it to target another individual, whether it's through harassment or verbal abuse, whether it's what we call microaggressions or small little things that can actually build into bigger things, or online chatter. But what makes somebody toxic as compared to someone who's difficult? And that's an important differentiation. People are toxic because not only do they cause harm, but they spread their behavior to others. So it's all about the spreading in terms of how we think about that. They have a pattern of de-energizing, frustrating, or putting other people down. So who tends to be toxic, right? If you're in an organization, you all probably know some of the toxic types that you encounter. So it's a person who's overconfident and narcissistic, someone who's self-centered and also people who have to follow the rules. They like rules. They like structure to the point where it actually becomes a toxic element. Also, people who are insecure, people who are incompetent, they can't do their jobs, and so they're threatened by others. Or paranoid people can have toxic tendencies. Also, people who are threatened, real or imagined by other people, people who are petty, who basically focus on things that are really insignificant, or people that are quick to find fault and share that with other people. So what are some of the outcomes of toxic people? You have basically an issue around morale, you have resentment, turnover and absenteeism, teamwork and productivity suffers, you have an issue with your clients and your customers. Profitability can basically be eroded, and then what happens? You have liability. So what are some of the types of toxic employees that you can have? I like some of these types, and we talk about them in my classes. First of all, we've all worked with the slacker, the person who doesn't do their job, right? And basically, we're always trying to cover for them. The bully, need I say any more? The gossip. I always tell my students, this is one thing you never want to engage with, and you don't want to engage with those who do gossip, because as soon as you leave the room, they're gossiping about you. So a gossip is a really, really destructive, toxic person. The lone wolf, the person that really can't work on a team and wants to do it on their own. The person who's a mess, right? The emotional train wreck, somebody who's always got fur flying and the dust settles and can they really get this job done in an organized way where I feel like they're in control. The person who's a know-it-all, has all the answers. Remember Daniel Levitin, if you think you know everything, you can't learn anything. And the yeller. Everybody's probably worked with somebody who yells in the workplace. But this is one of my favorites, the backstabber. And I hear this a lot from people that I've worked with, people that are my clients and students. The backstabber is somebody who feels insecure and emotionally vulnerable, and they're angry with themselves and the world. So how do they deal with that? They make up stories about other people or exaggerate mistakes and the weaknesses of the people that they know. And they also like to stir up conflict and drama. They enjoy seeing other people going at each other's throats. Very toxic people. But how do we look at how leaders create toxic cultures? Well, one of the things that I think it's interesting is if we were to take your workplace and put a camera and basically record what's going on in your workplace over the course of a full day, would you want that to be a training video on how to be in an organization? It's very interesting. And as you think about that, if you're a leader, and many of you who are on this call are, leadership is a privilege. And with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility, not only to behave in a way that you'd be proud of, but also to set an example for others, right? So really important leadership principles. So who are the leaders that can have issues? A leader who has scattered priorities. So this is someone who has time management issue. The leader can't get things done and they waste time. So if you're a leader that has scattered priorities, what should you do? Or what should you help a leader in this situation do? They should have clearly defined charters, who does what, focus on your strategic priorities. You have an articulated decision-making process. And I have over here what I like to use here, and hold it up. This is a magic 8-ball, which people used to use when I was a kid to make a decision. This should not be the way you make decisions, right? You should be actually very transparent in terms of how you make decisions. And you should have specific agendas basically for meetings with clearly defined outcomes so that people can actually see that you're making progress. Also, the leader that creates unhealthy rivalries. I work for somebody like this. This person likes to create rivalries and competition among teams. They play favorites. They create resentment, antagonism. They do things like they cite examples like, you should be like Bill, or you should be like Sally, like they're really smart. What does that do? That makes you feel like, you're not measuring up and you feel really uncomfortable. And it makes Bill or Sally feel really bad that they're used as the example and everybody's kind of looking at them with resentment. So it creates a bad feeling all the way around. So what do? You don't play favorites, right? You recognize all your team members as appropriate, and you find ways to encourage everyone rather than single anyone out. Striving to be fair. I always say that fairness is really one of the most unappreciated qualities that a leader can have, and we should all strive to be fair in all the aspects of our roles. Unproductive conflict. So speaking negatively behind somebody else's back. This is a boss who does this. They withhold their perspective. They use pocket vetoes. They agree to do something, knowing that they won't. And we'll talk about passive aggressive in a minute because this really borders on that. So what do? You create behavioral norms. You model the behaviors and you use greater transparency and accountability. No gossip, and stop the gossip when you see it. Follow through and address others who won't. It's like values. Unless you do something about them, don't have them, because no one will believe that you do. So you can't just, do one thing and basically expect others. You all have to be modeling the way in this regard. But then we have deeply flawed leaders. These are people that have deep-seated psychological problems. Can we do anything about these people? No, but we need to understand, kind of name them and what they are. So we've got the innately toxic leader, the narcissist, okay? This is a person who has grandiose fantasies about themselves. They're, pathological narcissists are selfish, they're inconsiderate, they demand a lot of attention, they feel entitled, they pursue power and prestige at all costs. And basically they may seem very confident, but that confidence clearly conceals a deep vulnerability and basically insecurity. Then there's the manic depressive, or someone who is bipolar. This is basically a mental disorder, and it can vary in its intensities. This is one of these people, you never know who you're going to meet. One day they're one way, one day they're, I actually worked with someone like that. And we used to say that about her. We never know who we're going to meet when we see her walking down the hall. Their reality is impaired, whether manic or depressed. They have a poor insight into how they're being perceived and how they act towards others. And then there's the passive aggressive, which we see a lot more in organizations, I find. It describes a person who expresses negative feelings and then shies away from confrontation. So what do? A passive aggressive person may agree to a request. They may express resentment by missing deadlines, showing up late, making excuses. Basically, they say one thing and they do another, right? And you never know if you can have confidence in anything that they're saying. They use procrastination, they're inefficient, they have selective forgetfulness, and they avoid fulfilling obligations. And these types of leaders can become dysfunctional. And then there's the emotional disconnected leader. They don't have any feelings. They display little imagination. They're unable to describe or even recognize their feelings or the feelings in others. And so that makes it difficult for them to basically interpret the emotional signals of other people. So these kinds of individuals, the emotionally disconnected, can be very successful in large bureaucratic organizations, or what we characterize as paramilitary organizations, where safe predictability and inconspicuousness is rewarded. In other places, they don't work because they don't exude a vision, they don't motivate, they don't cultivate creativity, and their emotional absence can actually be very damning and can basically not allow employees to feel that they can innovate. So as we look at this, what can leaders do? And many of you on this call are leaders in some very significant roles. Basically, you want to have purpose-driven work. You want to empower other people, micromanage less, right? Listen better. This is something that I think everyone needs to work on, because sometimes it can be really hard, especially when we're in this pandemic and this kind of emotional situation that we're in. You want to value other people's times. You want to have regular emotional intelligence check-ins, and you want to get feedback, really, whether it's you get it on your own or you ask a third party to do so. But why don't people speak up in a bad situation? Basically, people don't speak up because they evaluate as having risk, whether they're going to get their job is going to suffer, they're going to get poor evaluations, their relationships are going to erode, and they could suffer, and also that you can be labeled as a complainer, and you can have what's called the bystander effect. And the bystander effect is something that came into, basically, it was a term that was coined in the 1960s in New York City, when a woman was murdered and all of her neighbors witnessed it, and nobody called or the police or intervened or did anything about it. And basically what happens is people are thinking other people are going to do something about it, so nobody does anything about it. We see this a lot with, sexual, racial harassment in the workplace, age harassment, where people see it happening, and they see it's happening to you or somebody else, but nobody does anything about. So this is kind of an element that you need to be mindful about. So what are some of the signs that there is a toxic culture? Basically, we look at, there's silos. Basically, it's a siloed organization. Sometimes when you go for a job interview, they may say that, we're very siloed here. What happens then? It's all about me. It becomes very, very difficult. People have a fear of speaking up, right? That's the organization where everyone's shut down. There's lots of rules, and there's the hierarchy to protect them. A very command and control organization, right? Top-down communication only, so there's not any kind of dialogue or discussion that's going on. There's a lot of lights, camera, and action. There's drama everywhere. Furs flying, as I mentioned, the dust settles, what's happening here? There's more backstabbers than there are handshakes. So that's really an important element to look at. And basically, if there's a lot of churn at the top, you read about, organizations where they've had 4 CEOs in 5 years, not a good sign. So that if you have a leadership conveyor belt, not a good sign as well. And then basically people circle the wagons. They're trying to protect the status quo. This is an organization that will become obsolete because they don't want to have change, right? And then we looked at the whole notion of emotional intelligence with the really important book by Daniel Goleman. It refers to basically your capacity to recognize your feelings and motivate yourself and others in the process in those relationships. So as we look at the EI construct, there's basically 4 major categories. Self-aware, knowing basically what's going on with your own emotions, right? Then the management of those emotions, whether it's being in control, whether being adaptable, being achievement oriented, also having a positive outlook, because people don't like to be around a negative person. The other thing is social awareness. I mean, in crisis, we know we always lead with empathy and understanding. Social awareness and empathy is really, really important, and is considered one of the most important elements of a leader. And then there's organizational awareness, right? The final thing is we look at, relationship management. How are you influencing other people? How are you coaching and mentoring people? Conflict, teamwork, and basically inspiring. So these 4 elements form the EI construct. But can you get better at emotional intelligence? You bet. In fact, there's a lot of scientific research that shows that as you actually practice emotional intelligence, those neurons and things that happen in your brain start getting cultivated and actually grow and connect. And so when you don't have to intentionally think about being emotionally intelligent as often, because it naturally comes to you. We all know the leader who's really emotionally in control. That person is someone to follow, and that we all know the person on the other side. So you absolutely can get better at emotional intelligence. So as you think about your 2021 resolutions, think about it this way. Some of the best transformational coaches tell us that in order to actually achieve whatever goals we're trying to do, think of them in small pieces. You don't want to kind of have this makeover all at once, but try and work at certain elements of how you operate, how you address stressful conversations, and how you actually address your teams, whether it's as a team member or as a leader, in terms of how you navigate, whether it's toxic behaviors, stressful conversations, or motivating people. Because you, at the end, you make it happen. So with that, I want to apologize, first of all, for my little issue with my slides. So I hope it didn't distract you too much. And I hope I was emotionally intelligent in the moment. And I want to ask if anyone has any questions or any comments or anything that you'd like to share.
Hi, if everybody could just put any questions in the chat, and I will be happy to ask them of Jacqueline. Jacqueline, that was outstanding. I think that's good life advice, not even just work advice, but thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right. Any questions so far from anyone? I'm getting a lot of fantastic content and presentations. Here we go. Do you have any suggestions for questions to ask potential employers during job interviews to assess whether the organization is toxic?
Oh, that's a really important question. And in fact, we talk about that in my classes. I would step back and when you're going into those conversations, I would ask the person that you're interviewing, what are their values? See if they can answer that question, first of all. And then, with that, ask them, okay, what your values are, then what are some of the ways in which you achieve your values? That will tell you a lot about the organization, because if an organization doesn't have a stated values, or people don't know what they are, that says a lot about the organization to start. So then you'll have basically insight into what the organization is. I mean, we can all go online and look at reviews of organizations in terms of Glassdoor and other sites in terms of what people have to say. But asking the question in the moment, I think is really, I would start with the values conversation, and then you can actually start gauging what kind of organization it is and how people basically adhere to certain behavioral standards and how they evaluate and value their employees.
Great, thank you. All right, so my chat box is just flying here, so I may not get to all these, but let's see. Should you go? Sorry, hang on one second.
I see
What do you
some of my students. I see some of my students saying stuff. I'm sorry.
What do you think is the most? What do you think is the most common emotional intelligence weakness for young women earlier in their career, and what are tips to improve in that area?
Well, I think I'm a person that doesn't believe in stereotyping, so I don't think young people tend to do this. I think when you're earlier in your career, however, you don't have the experience that, obviously you build through the course of your career. So I think one of the things that people don't know how to do earlier in their career is evaluate the seriousness of something that they may be facing, evaluate the importance of relationships in the organization and how powerful people will be. We talk a lot about power in my classes and kind of what that means. And so one of the things that I think is most important as you start in your role, in your jobs, is basically how you navigate building your relationships early on, cultivating those relationships so you have people that are go-to that you can trust. And as you build that, I'm sorry. So, I think as you kind of cultivate the relation, I'm sorry, I'm hearing some feedback or somebody. Anyway, as you cultivate these relationships, I think that early in your career, that will help you navigate the importance and understand the significance of what's going on. I don't know that there's a thing.
Jacqueline, you're actually muted because Ruth muted everyone because of the feedback.
Okay, I'm sorry. So one of the things that I'll say, I don't know how much I was just unmuted so that you can hear me again, is one of the things that I think it's really important. I've had students in my classes who are very young and very, very emotionally intelligent. And I think some people just are exceptional that way. I think one of the things that we have a tendency to do is not as I said, understand the importance and the significance of the things that we're experiencing. And that's where mentorship can really help. That's where having someone who's a sponsor in a powerful position can help you actually navigate what is important and what isn't. I think that's one of the things that a lot of people suffer from.
Somebody here says that this person has been accused of having a disrespectful tone on Slack, but my comment was just direct. Can you talk about the danger of ascribing intent and emotion to chat and email?
I was just going through this yesterday with an organization that I'm involved with where somebody sent notes out that were, less as you say. I think one of the good things you should do is you should read your messages out loud and hear them, because sometimes when we send the words, we don't actually hear the words. And so even though you may have a really good intent to just be direct sometimes can be seen as harsh. And so I would border on being less direct if necessary, so that you can ensure that you don't go into the waters of basically being seen as harsh and difficult. And, especially I find if you're dealing in an organization that has people that speak English as a second language, I find this particularly true, and I've worked in global organizations my entire life, or people that come from different cultures. So words have different meanings and emphasis, and that's a really important thing that we have to actually understand. So one of the ways is if that's a conflict, as we talked about earlier, is to reach out to this person and say, let me understand, if you can send a private note, I'd like to understand your perspective a little bit better so that, I can be clearer in terms of what you mean. There's a lot that's being chatted on LinkedIn and Slack right now in terms of it's actually amping up, and there's a lot of discussion about how people should be characterizing their comments, because it's building your brand, and that becomes really important.
Thank you. Any tips on how to have healthy but hard conversations via Zoom?
Well, that's the way we're having conversations these days. So One of the things about Zoom is it's a formal media. I mean, we're all meeting by Zoom, we're meeting with our family, our friends, right? We're going to funerals on Zoom. I mean, it's just everywhere. I conduct some of my classes on Zoom. I think that one of the things that you can do if you're trying to open up the conversation is open up the conversation from the beginning and just try and get it to a point where if you were with the person in person, how would you actually talk with them? Rather, this is not like a mandated meeting, how you open up the conversation with the person if you're in person, using your tone, have a warm tone to kind of help them feel comfortable so that actually you get them to start talking and then you can start having more of an exchange rather than feeling that it's the formality of the media is taken over and that you don't own the conversation that the actual media channel does. And I think that's important. One of the things that I think is really helpful, and we talk about this a lot in my classes and with my clients, is the importance of practice. And in fact, if you're going to have a contentious or stressful conversation, practice, right? Say the words, role play with somebody else, help them, help you navigate that conversation. And you'll learn a lot about yourself in that process and you'll grow. It's a really, really good thing to do. I mean, I even went through this presentation myself, before and of course we had this little slide snafu, but I went through these slides and I actually said the words, right? And I think practice shows tremendous care. When you practice, it'll come through. And that's also, people will really appreciate that. So I strongly, strongly support people doing that.
I agree wholeheartedly, Jacqueline. I think that's a great strategy. Should you go for a job that will help your career, but the manager has a difficult personality? Any advice on how to approach that decision?
Well, I don't know. Well, I can't help people make life decisions on a Zoom event here. Careers are really important, they're really important, and understanding what you want and where you're going is a whole different conversation, and whether this job will help you do that. If you can see your way clear to, and I don't know what this person is difficult and how they are difficult, but if the job is going to give you, enough to overcome the boss. I mean, there's all these people that say people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses, or they don't leave companies, they leave bosses. However, there may be certain things that you can get from this job that really satisfy your career aspirations. And if you know that even if the person's difficult, you can put up with it for a year or two or whatever. And I don't know what they're difficult about. So that's also an important point. So you have to evaluate, it's really an evaluation. And I'm a list person. I put pros and cons in terms of how you evaluate whether something is, going to be something that's positive for you or something that's actually, your situation is really good now. And so it's really a risk. There is a risk to going to a job anywhere you go, because you never know what it's going to be like until you get there. And this person may not be as difficult, or you may be able to navigate them better than the other people. So that's the other thing. I mean, you don't know how to evaluate what you've heard. At least I can't really speak to that, but hopefully that's a little helpful.
Let's see here. Here's a situation that somebody's dealing with. My supervisor has poor emotional intelligence and seems to thrive on creating adversarial relationships and conflict. She harms relationships with colleagues in other departments, and my team members and I then need to repair those relationships so that they'll continue working with us. How do you suggest we try to address this situation?
Well, you're not going to overturn your boss unless her boss or his boss thinks so. So I believe in building kind of a group of people that can actually come together and then work and then collaboratively work together so that it influences that maybe the boss might see kind of what you're being able to do, or maybe others will see. I belonged to organizations which were led by a person that was extremely toxic, and yet the people in the organization, it sounds like in this situation, it's true, the people that are working with are not. So the more that you can actually build bridges with people on your team, your colleagues, people in other departments, and then be able to hopefully influence the outcome that way, kind of lead from the outside, rather than, you can't change her. So the other thing is other people might see what you're doing and then decide that, you know, you're so influential that you really are important to the organization, and start seeing the negative influence that she has on your team and on the other organization as a whole. But the other thing is that if this person is being allowed to behave this way, somebody is allowing her or him, right? Somebody is allowing him. And this is how subcultures get formed in organizations. Like the organization has these values at the top, but then other people over here and over here start doing other things, and it goes unpunished, unnoticed. And so then you have these subcultures with bad behaviors that get cultivated. So you have to say to yourself, why are they allowing her to behave like this? Clearly, they've got to see it. They've got to see that other departments are seeing this. So I think that's a really important thing to consider in this situation.
And Jacqueline, just to pick on that, because I think this is something that you hear about so often, where people have a difficult, supervisor who's creating difficult relationships, or perhaps taking all the credit, or any one of the attributes you described earlier. And at times those people do go to HR, or they go to that person's supervisor. I mean, do you think there comes a point where the decision, frankly, is just up to you if you want to stay in that culture, if you feel you've exhausted your avenues for addressing the behavior, especially when it's your boss, and that's obviously a tough situation to be in?
Well, I think one of the hardest decisions that anyone has to make in their career is when to leave.
Yeah.
And so when do you need to leave your job? If the situation is that untenable and it's not going to change, then you have to kind of look it at the face and say, I need to leave the situation. You know, I think it's hard for some people to do that, to have the courage to recognize it and name it. But once you actually make the decision that this is really an untenable situation, you'll be freed up to actually explore other things that may be a whole lot healthier for you to be in. Because if you're in a situation where you're always worrying about your boss and what he or she is going to do, how much are you going to grow? You're going to be a nervous wreck. And I've been in that situation. I'm sure a number of people on this webinar have been in that situation. It's awful. It is awful, right? So, I was a young, mom working, and I went through all of that with, a lot of other people that weren't in that situation. And I remember the stress that I felt and all of that. There's a lot of situations where you have to really look it squarely in the face and say, I can't live like this, right? This is not good. This is not good for my life.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to paraphrase this question. It just went out of my my chat box here. Let me just see if I can get it in here. Well, I'll tell you, here we go. Let's see. So, this is the question. I find that women are oftentimes viewed as, quote, emotional at work by openly and professionally communicating our concerns. Those of us that are emotionally intelligent can be thoughtful and passionate, and this can be construed as being emotional, especially when you're working with men. Any advice on how to better communicate between the sexes in senior leadership, especially when there are varying degrees of emotional intelligence?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand is something that we characterize as stakeholder understanding. So you need to understand who you're talking to. So before you enter into a conversation with somebody or a situation, we often go at it like, what do we want to get from the situation? But you have to put yourself in the other, that's why role play is so helpful. Look at it from the other side and think about how you might consider the situation from the other perspective. If you consider the situation from the other perspective, then you'll be a lot more successful in crafting your strategy in terms of how you can be influential. So, I always say, think like a stakeholder from the outside in. So don't think of something like what you want to have happen. Think about what that person is looking for, and then how you can influence what you want given their perspective. If you actually live your career that way, you'll be extraordinarily successful. The thing is, most of us just don't think about that because we're all about what do we want to get done. But if you actually kind of reverse the perspective in that way, it'll help you actually more clearly and more effectively get to what you actually are trying to achieve.
Right.
I don't care whether it's male, female, young, old, whatever, different cultures. That's a really good strategy. Client, customer, supplier or whatever.
Okay, great. I think I've got time for maybe a couple more questions. So let's see. Somebody's wondering if if you discover that you're working in a very toxic work environment, but you haven't been in the organization long, less than 1 year, for example, you know, do you need to commit to a 2 to 3 year, you know, position at a company so you don't appear to be unstable? You know, if you leave within a year because it's too toxic, does that reflect poorly, or could you be perceived to reflect poorly on you? Should you stick it out for an extended period just to show some stability in your work history?
Well, interesting point here. I think the contemporary world that we live in is people don't expect people to stay. I mean, in my career, I moved around every few years, and some people thought I was a jumper, and I'm like, are you kidding? I was there 5 years. But that was a jumper. I mean, like, you know, as I worked for 30 years in corporations, people thought, oh, you should stay with the same one like you're 30 years. I'm like, really? So, you know, I look at it differently. I think that, you know, the fact of the matter is, I think, you know, as you build your career, I think more frequent jumps are not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, if you get opportunities and then there's an irrational reason why you're going to different places and you get better opportunities, then why would that reflect badly on you? I think people start questioning it when there's gaps between jobs and when there seems to be kind of strange moves that you've made. Then I think it starts getting questioned. But just the fact that, you know, you're here, there, 2 years here, and you have another opportunity. Sometimes you may be limited in the opportunities where you're at. So, you know, it might be a smaller organization or a smaller department, and so clearly, or a different kind of organization. So I think if you have a rational, you know, basically talk track in terms of why you're doing something, it makes perfect sense to me. But again, there are some organizations that really like to see like 10 years here or 5 years here. You're not going to change them. And I don't know whether you'd want to work there anyway.
Okay. A lot of people have been asking, Jacqueline, before we have to wrap, do you have any books you recommend or podcasts that address this issue of, you know, emotional intelligence, or other resources folks can, you know, pursue?
Yeah. So my friend Nancy Halpern, who has been a guest lecturer at my class, and I think Nancy was going to be on. I don't know if she's on today. She does a lot of work she has a podcast, and you can connect with her on LinkedIn. And she does a lot of work in political IQ, which is very interesting. She goes in and diagnoses how political an organization is, which I think is really interesting. I'm a huge fan of Daniel Goleman and do a lot of reading. I can actually provide the AMA with some sources so that I'm actually more reflective rather than just blurting out some books and ideas. The other thing is that you can actually learn about organizations in unexpected places. So my friend Art Bell, who was the creator of Comedy Central, who's guest lectured in my classes, he came out with a book about his experience creating Comedy Central. And what's interesting about that book is the book is called, you know, basically Constant Comedy, How I Created Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And in that book, he talks about not so much the creation of Comedy Central, which it also talks about, but he also talks about some of these situations and organizational issues he had to address, being a intrapreneur, someone creating a new business inside an existing organization, which was HBO. And ultimately he gets fired, and he talks about how, you know, he always thought getting fired was you couldn't do your job. And he realized it became a whole different, you know, the company was taken over, or actually they brought in new management. And so he had a different perspective. I think it's a really good book to like look at one person's experience. So it's not an academic book, but it's actually an experience book. So Constant Comedy is a good read as well. But I will also give some thought to some examples. I've written a lot of articles on values and certain aspects of organizational awareness that you can also read. I'm actually coming out with a book later this year on personal brand, and my second podcast will launch next quarter, which will talk about, which will basically have people that are doing important things in this moment.
Excellent. Well, we will follow up on our website as well in our post-event wrap, Jacqueline, and we can include some of those resources. Jacqueline, thank you so much for this
My
outstanding
pleasure.
presentation, really informative and insightful. Thank you, Brooke and Women in Cable Telecommunications for sponsoring today's event, as well as our other partner, Green Book. And please go check out the AMA New York website, join our social platforms, and if you're not already a member, consider becoming a member, everybody.
And everybody, please connect with me on LinkedIn and provide me with comments or questions. I am very responsive. I'm a PR person, so I spent years responding to reporters all over the world, and I'd love to hear from you all, really.
Great.
I mean that.
And thanks to Ruth Bartos, who is our tech master here today. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth.
All right, everybody, have a great day. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.